So this is chapter 14. So last chapter we talked about the meeting of the two different parts of the world, Eurasia and Africa, meeting North and South America. And now we're going to talk about how those two coming together and creating a global society really changed the whole world economically. So we're going to be focusing mainly on the economic side of things here. And we're really going to spend a lot of time talking about the slave trade, because the slave trade was a huge it's a huge economic consequence of these two sides of the world coming together. And so the last part of this chapter will be focusing largely on the transatlantic slave trade. So again, that's going to be a huge part of it. You can see this is a picture of a slave merchant, a European slave merchant in Africa negotiating for some slaves, making it look a lot better than it really was, a lot less cruel. I mean, I guess there's some aspects on which the artist is making it look pretty upsetting, I suppose, with the chains around their legs and whatnot, and I guess they look kind of sad, but certainly making it look a lot less brutal than it was in reality. So we'll start off with a little introductory vignette, as we normally do. So this is a quote. It says, "I have come full circle back to my destiny, from Africa to America and back to Africa. I could hear the cries and wails of my ancestors. I weep with them and for them." And this is actually an entry from a guest book to a castle, Cape Coast Castle, which was a major port of embarkation for enslaved Africans. This would be along the coast of modern-day Ghana. One of many. There were other ports of embarkation, but certainly this was a big one. The west coast of Africa, as we'll see, is going to be the major source of slaves for the transatlantic slave network. So the transatlantic slave trade system was and continues to be enormously significant. We only have to look to current issues involving race in our nation today to realize that it's still relevant. And to truly understand what's going on today, you have to understand, how did we get here? And this is the start of how we got here. So it's hugely significant today. The slave trade system was only one part of the international trading networks that shaped the world between 1450 and 1750. It's a big part of it. It's the driving force behind it economically, but there is more going on as well that we will discuss. So at this time, the Europeans are going to start breaking into the Indian Ocean spice trade, which is already in existence. So this spice trade has been going on throughout the Indian Ocean and the countries that border the Indian Ocean, as well as some further ones for some time. The Europeans are participants into it in so much as they are consuming the spices. They want the spices, but now they want to become major players in this spice trade. And so that's going to be a driving force. They want access to these spices. Silver that's going to be mined in the Americas are going to allow for greater European participation in the commerce of East Asia. It's going to help to finance that, as we'll see. As well as fur trapping and trading. We don't really think about this as being hugely significant economically, fur trappers. I just remember back to, high school and before, when you talk about the French fur trappers who lived here in the region of Illinois prior to European settlement, prior to English settlement, I should say. Of course, the French are European. And you just think, all right, they were French fur trappers, but fur trapping and the sale of furs was hugely significant at this time as a very warm source of clothing. If you'll recall, and we'll mention it again, Europe is going through a cooling period right now, and so that's going to be hugely significant as well, both economically and for the natural environment. So Europeans are going to become increasingly prominent in long-distance trade, but other peoples were also important. Again, this Eurocentric view of world history has prevailed for so long that it's hard to realize that that really wasn't the case. The Europeans are going to become more prominent at this point with the establishment of European colonies in North and South America. It's going to give them the economic push to become big players in the international world, but really they've just been kind of the outliers for a variety of reasons, the Black Death being one of them, that really pushed them back further economically than the rest of the world. So they're coming late to the game, but they're becoming increasingly more important. And commerce and empire are going to be the two forces that drive globalization between 1450 and 1750, both of those working together. And the age of empires is really going to come after this. All right, so the Europeans want commercial connections with Asia. We've really already established that. There are very valuable spices as well as other goods in Asia, but really the spices are the main motivator that the Europeans want to have access to and really want to dominate that market. So both Columbus and Vasco da Gama sought routes to Asia. We know that Columbus, that was his purpose. In going west, it was not to find a new world, but rather to find a western route to get access to the Indian Ocean trading network, to get access to China. And we know that he thought he was there. He thought he was in India, which is why Native Americans came to be called Indians, something that persists to this day. And Vasco da Gama went the other way. He went around Africa. Around the tip of Africa, the first one to go that way. So the Portuguese are going to be the first to dominate that route, as we'll see in detail a little bit more further on. But both of them, the purpose is to get a trading route to Asia. And as I said before, above all, the main motivation is the desire for spices. There are other Eastern products that were sought, but spices are the big one. And you always think, spices, like what's the big deal? You can go to the grocery store and get spices. They're not that exciting. But we have to put ourselves back into the way that people lived back then. And one of the ways that they lived is, in terms of food that was very different from ours, is that they don't have refrigeration. And so if you wanted to have something longer than, the initial days after you, especially meat, after you have procured the meat, you have to salt it down, like beef jerky. That's all they have. They don't have refrigerators. They don't have ice boxes even. So that's pretty much all they have. And it doesn't always taste very good. And they had limited spices that were native to Europe. And so they would like to make their food taste better, especially food that has to be preserved for long periods of time. And if you're wealthy enough to be able to afford it, that's a luxury that you really want. And we take it for granted that we want our food to taste good all the time. And we have access to a lot more food than they would have had. But if you think about how terrible just plain salted down meat would be without any spices, you get the idea of why these people wanted spices. So part of the reason why they're getting more involved is that the European civilizations are recovering from the Black Death. The Black Death, as you know, probably from taking other Western Civ classes, or I hope you know, or at least you have some knowledge of what it was. Terrible disease, terrible pandemic that would come periodically throughout the High Middle Ages, the Late Middle Ages, and just decimated Europe in every aspect of society that you could think of, socially, economically, politically. Now they're just starting to come out of that. And part of that was the Renaissance. And part of it also is an economic recovery. People are becoming wealthier. And because they're becoming wealthier, again, they want access to those spices. It's not just aristocratic classes that want it. It's also wealthy merchant classes that are going to want spices. And so that's why there's this big economic push. You have the demand, but you don't have the supply. So how do we get to that supply? That's the question. Also, national monarchies were learning to govern more effectively because of this. Remember, politically, the Black Death just made society spin out of control. Now we're seeing a solidification and nation building. And so these monarchies are able to mobilize resources better to get into the spice. Some cities in Europe were starting to become international trade centers, and they were growing. And this is, again, late to the game. We see in the Middle East, and we certainly see in Asian countries, especially China, there have been international trading centers in cities for for years and years and years. But remember, because of what's been going on in Europe and the decimation that they faced, particularly hard from the Black Death, they've been in recovery mode, and now they're starting to come out of that. And they face problems breaking into the Indian Ocean trade network. Number one, the Muslims largely controlled the supply coming from the different spice-producing regions of Asia and Southeast Asia. They control the overland trade routes. So they've basically got a monopoly on it. And then in Europe, the city of Venice, which is in modern-day Italy, was the chief intermediary for trade. I say modern-day Italy because Venice then was its own independent city-state. There is no quote-unquote Italy. There's no nation of Italy at this time. It's broken up into little different independent principalities, and parts of modern-day Italy are part of other empires as well. So Venice is the chief intermediary for trade. If you've ever been to Venice or you've seen a picture of Venice, you can really see this. There's a lot of Middle Eastern and Asian influences in the architecture of Venice, and that's because they were the middleman in between the Muslim traders and Europe. And other states resented it because it made them rich. There is also a desire to find Prester John to enlist his support in the Crusades to try to take back the Holy Land from the Muslims. Yes, that is still a desire that they have. It's still a sore spot for Christian nations that the Holy Land is in the hands of Muslims. Prester John is this mythical ruler of some, it's not really clear, Middle Eastern or Asian nation. And I say it's not really clear because he didn't exist. So if you read different sources, there's different ideas as to where he was. But they believed that somewhere out there was this Christian kingdom amongst Muslim and other Buddhist nations. And if they could only find him and get his support, he would help them finally drive the Ottomans out of the Holy Land. But of course, he didn't exist. So they didn't know that. Also, they were constantly in a trade deficit with Asia. Asia was making money off of the trade. Of course, they're the ones with all the supply, and they want to fix that. Okay, the Portuguese are going to be first to break into this trading network, this Indian Ocean commercial network, which was very big, very rich, very ethnically diverse, and largely pretty peaceful. I mean, anytime you have money involved, there's going to be some sort of animosity, but it's more or less peaceful before the Europeans come into the game. It exists. They trade amongst themselves more or less peacefully, and that's just the way it goes. The Portuguese did not have the goods of a quality for effective competition to, break into it and start their own network. So what they're going to do is to try to establish their own trading posts, which, as you can see here, the territories that you see outlined like along the coast of Africa in orange are going to be territories that were under Portuguese control. Eventually the Dutch, as we'll see, are going to get into this as well, as are the Spanish, and we'll talk about the British later, because of course the British in India is something that most people know about, and we'll get into that. But we're not there yet. So, since they can't really compete in terms of introducing their own goods into this trading network, what do? Well, they take to piracy. Their ships are very maneuverable. They have very good engineering, and they were able to carry cannons. And because of this, they established and fortified bases along the coast of Africa. Remember, the Portuguese are the first to send explorers all the way around the Cape of Good Hope at the tip of Africa and into the Indian Ocean Trading Network. So as they go, they're kind of skimming the coast of Africa. They're able to establish these fortified bases as bases for their trading empire. So the Portuguese created a trading post empire. Their goal was to control commerce, not necessarily territories or populations. They're not really looking to establish colonies in this way. They really more want to have these fortified trading positions. And in order to do that, they're operating by force of arms, not economic competition, because they don't have anything for economic competition. And at their height, they control about half of the spice trade to Europe. So again, their point is to bypass Venice and bypass the Muslims who control the overland trading network, and they themselves become the middlemen, to establish a way to get into the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia, take the goods, take them to Europe, and then they sell them. So they buy the spices, they're the middleman. That's what they want to do. And so that's what they were able to do pretty successfully for a time. So the Portuguese are going to gradually assimilate to Indian Ocean trade patterns. Again, they carry Asian goods to Asian ports. A lot of them are going to settle in Asian or African ports where they have fortified bases. Again, they don't have colonies in the traditional sense. They really have that trading post empire, as we said. But by 1600, their trading empire is in steep decline, and other nations are going to step into that power. Spain's going to be the first one to challenge Portugal's waning control over the spice trade. They are going to establish their own base in the Philippines. At the time, the Philippines were organized into small competitive chiefdoms. And running from colonial Mexico, the Spanish conquest was relatively easy, often bloodless, involving gifts, alliances, gunpowder, or the use of religion in order to establish their dominance over native groups. They also, as I mentioned before, carried out a major missionary campaign in Filipino society, making it the only Christian outpost in Asia. And they also introduced forced relocation, tribute, taxes, and unpaid labor. And they established large estates for Spanish settlers. So this is really where we're going to start to see actual attempts at colonization, not just trading posts as the Portuguese had. So Manila in the Philippines is going to become a major center with a very diverse population, and actually had significant Chinese population living there, which was essential to the colonial trading system. The Chinese largely resisted conversion to Christianity and occasionally did revolt against the Spanish. But the Spanish would often then resort to expulsions and massacres, for example, in 1603, when 20,000 were killed by the Spanish. So, after the Portuguese, after the Spanish, new countries are going to come into the fray, and these countries are going to be the Dutch and the English. They're going to do something a little bit unique, as we're going to see in a minute here, and they are going to enter the Indian Ocean trading network in the 17th century, so it's the 1600s. They're going to displace the Portuguese as well, who are then in decline, and they're going to compete with one another in a way that differs from the Spanish. So around this time, the Dutch and the English both organize private trading companies to handle their Indian Ocean trade. So this is the Dutch East India and the British East India trading companies. It's pretty easy to remember. Just swap out the countries' names, whatever country you're talking about, but they have the same name otherwise. These are, again, private companies in which people could invest, largely wealthy merchants, in the same way that you would invest in like a stock market today or a company today. Private investors would invest their money to back the companies and to share risks. So if one of the ventures doesn't go well, the risk is divided amongst the investors, and vice versa. When things do go well, investors do well. They also were given charters, these companies, by the respective governments, but the Dutch and the British governments. And they really had a lot of power. So it's hard to say that, like, think of them as companies in the modern sense that we would think of a company, because they not only had the power to control commerce and the spice trade, they also had the power to even make war on foreign people and to govern conquered peoples. Because if you think about it from their perspective, well, they're the ones taking all the risk to establish a trading monopoly, and if they need to make war, we need to give them the power to make war, because communication isn't great. They can't wait for permission from the British government or the Dutch government back in Europe, because again, we don't really have very good communication. It's letter writing that needs to go by ship or overland is going to take a long, long time. So they need to have that power. And so these companies had the power to do those things. they are going to establish their own trading post empires. The Dutch Empire is going to be focused on Indonesia, where mainly the Spice Islands are, where the English Empire is going to be largely focused on India. Now, we know that eventually India is going to become a British colony. It does not at this time. The Mughal Empire is still in control in India. They're very powerful, and so the British East India Trading Company is really there through the permission of the Mughal empires. They have permission to be there, and they're not establishing colonies. They're establishing trading posts is what they're doing at this point. Of course, that's going to change later on. We're not there yet. A French company is also going to be established, though not as powerful as the. So the Dutch East India Trading Company at the time was more well organized than the British. They monopolized both the shipping and the production of cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, things like that. So not only the shipping, but they also want to be able to control the production of these spices. So they're really getting involved in trying to create a monopoly on the spice trade in these spices. In order to do that, they seized small spice-producing islands and forced the people there to sell only to the Dutch. So again, they're controlling the production. And they did this through violence. And that's how they carried this out. And because of that, they really destroyed the local economy of the Spice Island, in the process making the Dutch very, very well. So again, the British East India Trading Company, not as well financed, not as sophisticated at the time as the Dutch East India Trading Company, and as a result, it really couldn't break into the Spice Islands. So that is why they turned to India. But over time, the British Navy, which eventually is going to be at its height, the most powerful navy in the world, is going to gain control of the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf. So remember, they're not establishing complete control over India as the Dutch did in Indonesia, because the Mughal Empire is in charge and they're very powerful. So as a result, they negotiated with local rulers for the peaceful establishment of trade bases. They traded pepper was a big one, other spices as well. But eventually over time, cotton and textiles are going to become more important. Now, this is significant when we start getting into the Industrial Revolution and the textile mills in Great Britain. Great Britain is where the Industrial Revolution starts, but we're not there yet. But just keep it in the back of your mind. The Dutch and the English also become involved in carrying trade within Asia of bulk goods, and both are going to eventually evolve into typical colonial domination. But again, we're not quite there yet. So at this time, the European presence was much less significant in Asia than in the Americas or Africa, which we'll get to in a minute here. They weren't a real military threat to the great powers in Asia. Again, the Dutch were able to take control of Indonesia, the Spanish, and the Philippines, because they didn't have unified governments. But if you think about the unified governments of China, of India at the time, of Japan, as we'll see, they weren't a threat to them yet. So, for example, the then country of Siam was able to expel the French in 1688, and the French weren't able to do anything about it. So that gives you an idea of how they're breaking into this trade. They're not significant players as of yet. They're getting there. So again, we're going to talk about some of the other nations which were unified and strong in Asia at this time, one of which is Japan. The Portuguese are going to reach Japan in the mid-16th century. At the time, Japan was divided by constant conflict among feudal lords, and so they're not unified. That's going to happen in a little bit here. And so at first the Europeans were. However, once the Japanese were able to unify politically in the early 17th century, so the early 1600s, things are going to start to change. And they're a new nation, they're newly unified, and they are going to start regarding the Europeans as a threat to this new unity. And so there's going to be a mass expulsion of the Europeans who are there, who are largely missionaries. Additionally, Japanese were barred from travel abroad, and European traders were banned except for the Dutch at a single site. And so as a result, Japan is going to be very much isolated for a time. So Japan is going to be closed off from Europe
from 1650 all the way until 1850. So again, a considerable amount of time. However, it does remain connected to China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. It's not like they're not trading with anybody. They just don't want any involvement with the Europeans. Eventually, a wave of Japanese merchants are going to move into Southeast Asia in the 17th century. Using violent means similar to the Europeans, they are going to try to establish trading posts as well. However, the Japanese government refused to support these merchants and their criminal behavior, unlike the European states. So, Asian merchants are going to continue to operate despite the fact that there's now a European presence on the scene. Overland trade within Asia remained in Asian hands. Tens of thousands of Indian merchants lived throughout Central Asia, Persia, and Russia, also containing and traking out these trading routes. And some Indian family firms monopolized the buying and selling of specific products. So again, what do we gain from all of this? Europeans are breaking into Asian commerce, but they're not the dominant players yet. So, what is going to help change this? Well, the silver trade is going to be important. It is going to be even more important than the spice trade in creating a global exchange network. Those spices, again, are the main reason why the Europeans wanted to become involved in global trading. Enormous silver deposits were discovered in Bolivia and Japan in the mid-16th century. Bolivia and South America, of course. And in the early modern period, Spanish America produced about 85% of the world's silver. Significant. So this is the global slave trade. So everything that you see in North and South America that is purple is a Spanish territory. So you can see they control, at this point, a significant amount of North and South America. So China's economy at the time was huge and had a growing demand for silver because paying in using silver to mint coins, and paying in coins makes the exchange of goods that much easier. It's easier to use money than it is to do, say, a barter system. In the 1570s, additionally, the Chinese government consolidated taxes into a single tax to be paid in silver. Why? It's easier and more streamlined. As a result, the value of silver skyrocketed, and foreigners with silver could then purchase more Chinese products than before. As a result, silver was central to the world trade. So you see a silver drain to Asia. The bulk of the world's silver supply is going to end up in China. And this is because that's where the goods are coming from. That's where the demand is. And Spanish silver brought to Europe was used to buy Asian goods. Again, you're using the silver to buy Asian goods. So the majority of the silver is ending up in Asia. Silver additionally is going to buy African slaves, which we're going to get to in a minute here, and Asian spices. So much so was silver very important to global commerce that the Spanish Peace of Eight was widely used for international exchange. Again, exchanging via money, especially when you have a single form of currency, just makes it easier for trade and exchange. And so as a result,
Potosi in Bolivia became the largest city in the Americas.
Population 160,000, not a lot in today's terms, a lot back then, because that's where the world's
largest silver mine was. The city's wealthy
European elite lived in luxury because of the silver, whereas the Native American miners, Native Americans at the time, that's going to change, lived in pretty horrific conditions. So we see here's a silver mine in Bolivia. Silver is going to vastly enrich the Spanish monarchy. However, it's going to cause inflation, not necessarily economic growth in Spain. So if you don't know, in a nutshell, inflation is when you are overproducing money. It's supply and demand. The more there is of something, the less valuable it becomes. If you just start printing off a bunch of money, the value of money goes down. And so the more silver there is, the value of silver goes down. That's inflation. The Spanish economy was too rigid, mainly because the Spanish aristocrats who were in charge were against any kind of economic enterprise or economic change. They were looking to maintain their position at the top of the hierarchy of society, and they don't want to see that change with any kind of merchants or anybody else becoming wealthy. So as a result, the influx of silver caused inflation, which combined with the climate fluctuations of the Little Ice Age caused a general crisis in the 17th century. And this is really the start of the Spanish losing their dominance on the world stage, which is going to happen over time. It's not immediate, but slowly over time they're going to lose their dominance in terms of their dominance over other European countries. The Japanese government profited more from silver production than Spain did. They used their revenues to defeat their rivals and to unify the country instead of keeping it consolidated in the hands of a few. And they worked with the merchant class to develop a market-based economy, which we tend to associate more with Europe, but really the Japanese were doing a much better job of it than the Spanish were. Again, the Spanish aristocrats fearing the growth of the merchant class in Spain. Because of that, there was heavy investment in agriculture and industry, and as a result, they were able to avert an ecological crisis and also an economic crisis as well. In China, silver further commercialized the country's economy. I mean, people still needed to sell something to get the silver to pay their taxes, and so they're going to have to produce goods, and they're going to have to be creative in some aspects and come up with the production of new things, or to produce what they're already producing but doing it better so that they can get their hands on more silver so they can pay their taxes. Their economy also became more regionally specialized, different parts of China being famous for producing different things. However, deforestation was also a growing problem. As they want to expand farming, for instance, forests have to be torn down, and so that's going to cause an economic problem and a environmental problem as well. Japan was able to address this issue, but China didn't do it as well as the Japanese. So eventually, the Europeans are going to become middlemen in a world trade. They are funneling American silver to Asia through their trade in Asian goods. And as a result, Asian commodities take a market share from European products. Something else that's very important besides silver is the fur trade. Europe's supply of fur-bearing animals was sharply diminished by the 1500s through overhunting. Hunting too many, hunting them into extinction. But again, remember, at this time, the world is seen as we call it a little ice age. So it's a general cooling of temperatures throughout Earth. And this is going to, of course, increase the demand for furs because winters are getting colder. And so people need something that's warm to clothe themselves in. As a result, there's going to be intense competition for the furs of North America. As I mentioned before, the French are going to be prominent in the St. Lawrence River Valley, the Great Lakes region, including here in Illinois, and along the Mississippi River. There's still some old French fort ruins in this area that you can go and you can see. And the main reason why they're here is to get access to furs. British traders start moving into the Hudson Bay region as well. And the Dutch are moving into what is now New York in the search for profitable furs as well as other things. So, the North American fur trade, how did this work? Well, the Europeans usually traded with the Native Americans for furs or skins rather than hunting and trapping animals for themselves. So, French fur trappers or traders, they're out there and they're looking to make contact with Native Americans, and the Native Americans are going to be selling or exchanging the furs to the Europeans, who are then going to send it back through the global economy. This is going to have an environmental impact, though, as the demand for these furs greatly increases in North America to an extent that it wasn't before. For example, the beaver and other kinds of furry little creatures were driven to near extinction, and this is going to have an impact on Native American groups as well. In fact, many Native American sources will comment on this as being an issue. So you can see the French fur trading regions are in that kind of brownish color. I don't know why they picked that color, but they did. The English are in the orange, and the Russians are in the green. You can see the French being in largely what will become the Midwest part of the country, including here in Illinois. By the 1760s, hunters in the southeastern British colonies, because by the 1760s the British colonies are established, took about 500,000 deer every year. that's a lot because the British colonies aren't that big at this point. This trade is going to be profitable in some respects for the Native Americans. They're going to receive many trade goods in exchange for hides. The Huron chiefs, for example, are going to enhance their authority with followers and neighboring people because they're able to control European goods. However, the more they trade with the Native Americans, or the more the Native Americans trade with the Europeans, I should say, the more exposure they have to European diseases, which again, they don't have any immunity to. And so that's going to cause social devastation as well. Additionally, the fur trade generated much higher levels of inter-Native American warfare, which became more deadly with the introduction of European firearms. One of the things that they would be trading for are firearms to give them advantages against enemy tribes. And this is going to make the war between them more dangerous. And additionally, conflict between them is rising as competition to trade with the Europeans rise as well. So, Native Americans thus become more dependent on European trade goods. Again, iron tools and cooking pots, gunpowders and weapons is a huge one, again, looking to get an edge over enemy tribes. European textiles, flint and steel, and as a result, many traditional crafts were lost as they become more dependent on European goods. Additionally, many animal species were depleted through overhunting, and there was the deeply destructive power of alcohol on Indian societies. Native American societies did not produce alcohol on their own, so they had no exposure to alcohol prior to the European introduction of it. And if you don't have any tolerance for it, that's going to become a huge problem. The implications of the fur trade on Native American women. Many Native American women married European traders. This was especially true with the French. The French settlers were much more peaceable with the Native Americans than any other group. In Native societies, the status of men was sometimes enhanced because there was a new focus on hunting, which was traditionally something that was left to men. However, some new opportunities did arise for women in the production of wild rice, which was also traded, and maple syrup. Okay, so north
to South America, you have the Dutch, you have the French, and you have the British getting in on the fur trade there. The Russians got in on the fur trade as well, however, not in North and South America, but largely in Siberia. The profits of this fur trade were the chief incentive for their expansion. We talked a little bit about this in the last chapter. There should really be a review. But as they expand into Siberia looking for furs to trap and trade, there's a similar toll on native Siberians, disease on the local people, dependence on Russian goods, and the depletion of fur-bearing populations, so very similar. However, in this region, Russians didn't have competition, such as the English, the French, and the Dutch. So they forced Siberians to provide them with furs instead of negotiating commercial agreements, such as the Europeans in North America did with the Native Americans. Additionally, private Russian hunters and trappers competed directly with the Siberians to their detriment. The Siberians' detriment, I should say. Okay. So we are switching gears here to talk about a big part of what is driving this newly global trade, and that is the transatlantic slave system. So you can see regions of origin in Africa are labeled there in green. Pretty much on the western coast of Africa. The purple are their regions of destination, and the red are going to be the transatlantic slave routes. Now, as we'll see, slaves are coming out of Africa and going to other parts of the world as well, and those trade routes are labeled in blue, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So, between the mid-15th and mid-19th century, when most countries are going to outlaw slavery, the transatlantic slave system took an estimated 10.7 million people from Africa to the Americas. Again, this is the transatlantic slave system. We're going to talk about slaves from Africa going elsewhere as well. Millions are going to die in the process of transferal from Africa to North and South America. And this is a huge human tragedy. Really no other way to describe it. So the African slave system is going to transform the societies of all the participants. The African diaspora is going to create racially mixed societies in the Americas. It's going to enrich many, both the slave trade and the system of slavery itself. And additionally, slavery is going to become a metaphor for many types of social oppression that are going to continue
well after slavery is outlawed. So this picture is interesting. This is a picture depicting slavery in the Islamic world. So you see a wealthy Muslim woman there with her African slave. It is going to be slavery, African slavery in other parts of the world, and again, it's going to be a little bit different. Okay. This particular slave trade in context. Most human societies throughout history have had slaves. You can read the Bible and you can see that there was slavery there. The ancient Greeks had slaves. The ancient Romans certainly had slaves. Slavery's been around. This type of slavery is going to be different, as we can see. African communities had practiced slavery and sold slaves for centuries. The trans-Saharan trade often took slaves into the Mediterranean world and into Muslim societies, as you saw from that picture there. There was an East African slave trade since the 17th century going out into the Indian Ocean trading network. There was an Islamic slave trade that resulted in many Africans living outside of the continent as well. So it's really hard to talk about slavery in general because, again, it's existed throughout time of human existence. And so it really takes many forms, and it really depends on the region and the time period you're talking about. So thinking about the time period we're talking about right now. If you are a slave taken from Africa and taken into the Indian Ocean trading network, typically these slaves were often assimilated into their owners' households. Again, it depended on the place and time. Sometimes the children of slaves were free. Sometimes they themselves were also slaves. And the Islamic world is going to prefer female slaves, such as you saw in the picture that we had a couple slides before. They were largely slaves for domestic work, or you might think of in a European context, like a lady's maid, a personal maid for a wealthy woman. Whereas the Atlantic slave system favored male slaves because they wanted them for heavy plantation work. In North and South America, there's little hope of manumission or freedom. And again, that's something that's going to change even over time, and depending on the time period you're talking about. We tend to view slavery with the lens of what happened in terms of slavery in America, because that's the history of our country. But even that changed over time. So initially, when you had indentured servants, and you had Native Americans who were slaves, and you had African slaves in the early years of the British colonies, there wasn't a clear-cut division between the different groups. Sometimes African slaves even were slaves for a period of time, and then they were freed. But that's going to change. And eventually, slavery in North and South America is going to become wholly identified with Africa and with quote-unquote blackness. And that's what's different about this form of slavery than other forms of slavery in history that you might look at. So we'll just take the Roman Empire for an example. The Roman Empire had a lot of slaves, but there wasn't like one source from their slaves. Wherever they went, wherever they conquered, they took slaves. So slaves from all different parts of wherever the Roman Empire went. So there wasn't that racial element to it that we're going to start seeing now, where it's like, oh, well, this type of skin color equals slavery. So this is going to be a huge shift that we don't see anywhere else in the history of slavery. So the origins of Atlantic slavery actually are in the Mediterranean, because this is where the first sugar plantations were. Sugar production is going to be the first modern industry, and we say modern because it's going to have major capital investment from investors, use of technology to better produce sugar, disciplined workers, and a mass market. To produce sugar at this time was extremely labor intensive, and it was very dangerous. Initially, as we're going to see, they are going to use serf labor not wage workers. But eventually, slaves are going to be determined as ideal. And we'll talk about how we get to from Africa specifically. So, when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, which we talked about in a previous chapter, the main source of slaves for these sugar plantations was cut off. They actually used Slavic people from the Black Sea region. As a matter of fact, Slav sounds like slave because that is the word origin for slave. That's where it came from, because they were the main slaves on these sugar plantations. Now, these Slavic regions are under the control of the Ottomans, and they have to look elsewhere. And they're going to start to look for an alternative in West Africa. As a result, Africans become the primary source of slave labor for the Americas. Why? Again, Slavs weren't available anymore. Papal permission was given to Catholic states in 1452 to seek out slaves, non-Christian slaves. And also remember, the Native Americans who initially had died of European diseases, they were a source of slavery for a while, and again, they're dying out. Africans have traded with Europeans for a long, long time, and so they became, again, the ideal slaves. So again, you see over time this slow changing of their vision of slavery to exclusively mean people from Africa. So Europeans are also going to be seen as bad alternatives. So indentured servitude was a long way for people from Europe to get to the New World to help establish a better life. Indentured servants over time, for a variety of reasons, are going to be seen as too troublesome. And that's really something you'd get into more into American history class. So if you wanted to get more into that, that's where you would take. But a series of riots led to that. And again, slowly over time, this racial element coming into it. Again, indentured servants were expensive and they were temporary. They signed themselves into slavery, and so they had a time period in which their slavery would end. Africans were often farmers, so they had farming skills and knowledge. They had immunity to diseases. They were not Christians, so that made it less, or I should say, it made it more palatable, I suppose, is a better way of describing it, to the Europeans, and they were also readily available. Now, there's a long debate on how much racism was initially evolved. Again, initially it's not so clear-cut, but slowly over time you start seeing this division of Africans are slaves for life, Africans are slaves, as we start to see Native Americans fall out of favor and European indentured servants fall out of favor. So the slave trade was driven by European demand. They want to establish these plantations and mines in North and South America, and they need workers. And they need workers to work for free to make a better profit. Well, they don't need it. That's what they want, I should say. The Europeans traded freely with African merchants and elites. So from capture to sale on the coast, the trade was largely in African hands. Africans received trade goods in return, including firearms, often bought with American silver. And the slaves were then exchanged and journeyed from coast to coast and out of the country. This is going to escalate until, again, the large banning of slavery in about the mid-1800s. So, to begin with, during the 16th century, fewer than 3,000 slaves were shipped annually, but 1700 to 1850 marked the high point in the slave trade. Now, you may remember from an American history class that by 1850, the importation of slaves in America was already outlawed, but it was not outlawed in other parts of South America or the Caribbean. Who was enslaved? People largely from West and South Central Africa, so present-day Mauritania and Angola. And these are mostly people from marginal groups, so prisoners of war, debtors, criminals. Africans generally did not sell their own people. So these would be people that they captured again in war, people from other groups, not people from their own societies. So they didn't view them as their own people, if that makes sense. The Europeans largely saw them as all the same. They're Africans. But of course, African society is vibrant and it's diverse. And so these groups don't see it as selling their own people, because they're not their own people. They're not from their own communities, their own civilization. Again, this is a little bit different from what it might seem like for American history, but actually the vast majority of slaves ended up in Brazil and the Caribbean, and there were smaller numbers in North America, mainland Spanish America, or in Europe itself. And about 15% of those enslaved died during the Middle Passage, which is the actual transmission of the slaves from Africa to North and South America. There is going to be various forms of resistance by the slaves themselves, sometimes through things such as working slowly on purpose, sometimes outright rebellion, sometimes fleeing. There were societies that were established from people who had fled slavery. Enslaved slaves often mixed with other groups, Native Americans, mestizos, so that's Native American and Spanish, people of Native American and Spanish descent, and renegade whites, sometimes creating established communities. The biggest and most famous would be the Haitian Revolution of the 1790s, a successful uprising of slaves in the nation of Haiti, and the actually overthrow of the government there. So, consequences, the impact of the slave trade in Africa. Well, it does create new global linkages within this trading network. However, as a result, it's going to slow Africa's growth, while in contrast, Europe and China are going to expand in population because, for obvious reasons, there's going to be 10.7 million people taken out of the continent. And the demand for African slaves is going to generate economic stagnation and political disruption in Africa. Again, 10.7 million people are going to be taken out of a whole continent. It's pretty hard to develop economically when you have this huge diaspora of people. Those people who profited in trade did not largely invest in production. They didn't generate breakthroughs in agriculture or industry, since Europeans didn't increase demand for Africa's products, just for its people. So there's no investment by the Europeans in any African society because they're just there for the slaves. And so that's going to be to the detriment of African nations as well. Social effects, it's going to foster moral corruption in Africa for those people who are going to engage in the slave trade. It's going to unbalance sex ratios in Africa. Again, more men are in demand than women, although of course women will also be transported as well. It is going to substantially increase labor demands on women, lead to more polygamous households, the increased use of female slaves within the West African communities themselves. However, a few women are going to benefit by marrying European merchants. Some often operated their own trading empires. So in some ways, the power vacuum left by this expulsion of men is going to be beneficial for women. I use the term beneficial very loosely there. So here we have a scenario, a woman who is going to, a native African woman who is going to marry into a trading family and is going to establish a trading empire herself. Women also participated in several state building enterprises because, again, if you're going to have this mass men are largely going to be taken out of your civilization. Women are going to have to step into the fray. And so you're going to see several African kingdoms that often have female rulers because of this. And the transatlantic slave system is going to differ from place to place. So where slaves come from in terms of like what African nations is going to vary over time. The Atlantic slave trade is in effect for a long time, hundreds of years. And so some nations are going to actually outlaw slavery, the slave trade for a time within their own borders. Some are going to engage in it heavily, depending on how things are going economically within their own. For example, Benin, which is in the forest area of present-day Nigeria, actually limited the effects of the slave trade until about the 1700s. Because of this, they're able to diversify their exports. They're able to buy firearms and other goods and actually ban the export of male slaves until the 1700s. However, they did experience a decline in the 1700s that caused them to want to re-engage in the slave trade. So again, it varies in terms of region and in terms of what's going on economically at that particular time. So again, Dahomey is going to be another civilization that is going to actively participate in the slave trade during the early 1700s, but it was specifically under royal control. They had annual slave raids into neighboring kingdoms that was sponsored by the government, and the government actually depended on the slave trade for essential revenue, and as a result, they were heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, to wrap it up. History reveals two contradictory truths. Number one, our lives sometimes resemble those of past people. At the same time, our lives often differ from those of past people. Things have changed remarkably. Some things are universal. Emotions of people, people experience life. I mean, if you think about people of the past, and they tend to be just numbers and figures, but they were people just like us, and they had human emotions just like us, so that doesn't change. However, their worldview does change. Remember what I've said before in previous chapters, that the past is like a foreign country. So you can't impart your own modern worldview on people in the past. So something that is similar is globalization. That's pretty familiar to us. Global circulation of goods, international currency, world market production, the growing economic role of the West, private enterprise, national government supporting merchants. That all is something that is familiar to all of us. However, there's the obvious differences of scale and speed. More goods are circling internationally by the year 2000, and far more people producing for and depending on the world market than ever before. You have faster communication, economies firmly centered on Europe and North America by 1900. There are other differences in terms of the pre-industrial nature of the time period we're talking about. We haven't gotten to the Industrial Revolution yet, so there's no big factories yet. Also, the discrediting of slavery during the 19th century and the territorial empires of the 20th century have yet to occur in the time period that we're talking about. So, finally, our chapter question. Read sources. It's 14 through 1 through 14.6, but you can skip 14.5. And answer the following questions, since we're talking about a global economy here, the start of a global economy. In what different ways did the possession of foreign objects convey status in the early modern world?